Most people don't fail spiritual awakening because they are unconscious. They fail because they rush. They feel the confusion, the emotional distance, the identity cracking, and instead of staying with the process, they panic. They look for meaning too quickly. They reach for certainty. They try to turn an unfinished transformation into a finished identity. And that's where everything quietly collapses. At first, it doesn't look like failure. It looks like progress. They use the right language. They adopt spiritual explanations. They talk about awareness, detachment, higher perspective. From the outside, it seems like awakening is working. But internally, something goes numb. Depth turns into performance. Insight turns into repetition. Awareness turns into avoidance. Carl Jung warned about this exact moment. He understood that awakening, or what he would call individuation, is not destroyed by darkness. It's destroyed by premature light, by insight that arrives before the psyche is ready to embody it. This is why so many people say they awakened and then slowly lost themselves. They didn't fall asleep again. They fragmented. Because awakening isn't about seeing more. It's about integrating what you see. And integration is slow, uncomfortable, often invisible. This is the part nobody wants to talk about. The moment where you feel pressure to be evolved. The moment where confusion feels embarrassing. The moment where staying uncertain feels like weakness. So you choose clarity, but it's borrowed clarity. You choose meaning, but it's not lived yet. And that single choice becomes the mistake that quietly destroys the process. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, in ways most people don't notice until it's too late. Something subtle shifts. The clarity feels thinner. The sense of truth feels rehearsed. The inner movement stops, but the language keeps going. From the outside, it still looks like awakening. From the inside, something vital is missing, and almost no one realizes it's happening while they are inside it. Most people fail here. The mistake doesn't look like ignorance. It looks like intelligence. It looks like understanding too much, too fast. At this stage of spiritual awakening, awareness has expanded, but the psyche hasn't reorganized yet. You can see patterns clearly. You can name wounds. You can explain your past, your relationships, your trauma, your conditioning, and that creates a dangerous illusion, the illusion that seeing is the same as becoming. Carl Jung warned about this with unusual precision. He observed that when insight arrives before integration, the ego doesn't dissolve. It adapts. It puts on new language, new explanations, new identities. Instead of disappearing, it becomes more sophisticated. This is when insight stops being medicine and starts becoming armor. You relate to your experience from a distance. You analyze instead of inhabiting. You observe instead of feeling. The psyche stays busy, but it stops being transformed. This is why the mistake feels spiritual. You sound grounded. You sound aware. You sound detached. But beneath that calm language, something unfinished is being bypassed. The emotional work that doesn't respond to insight alone. The shadow material that can't be explained away. Jung called this inflation, when consciousness expands, but humility and embodiment don't follow. The ego identifies with awareness and mistakes it for wholeness. Instead of integrating the shadow, it claims to have transcended it. And this is where awakening begins to quietly break down. Not because awareness disappears, but because it becomes untouchable. Instead of deepening, insight starts circling itself. Instead of transforming, identity slowly hardens. Instead of moving forward, something inside you stops taking risks. From the outside, nothing seems wrong. From the inside, something essential goes quiet. You're no longer confused, but you're no longer changing either. And the most dangerous part is this. The psyche rewards this state. It rewards it with composure, with control, with the feeling of having arrived. But what actually happened is far subtler. You stepped out of the fire too early. And once you do, the process doesn't collapse. It doesn't punish you. It simply waits. The psyche doesn't choose this mistake because it's naive. It chooses it because it's tired. After a period of inner disruption, something fundamental has already broken. Old certainties collapsed. Old identities lost their grip. And beneath awareness, there's a quieter impulse that rarely gets named, the need to feel stable again. Not enlightened, not whole, just stable. To understand why false stability feels so convincing, imagine this. You've been crossing a long suspension bridge in heavy fog. At first, the movement was necessary. You had to keep walking. You couldn't see the other side, but you knew you couldn't go back. Every step demanded attention, courage, and tolerance for uncertainty. That's what the early phase of awakening feels like. Then, halfway across the bridge, you find a small platform. It's solid. It doesn't move. You can finally stop feeling the sway beneath your feet. Relief floods your body. You tell yourself, this must be the other side. But it isn't. It's just a resting point. This is what false stability looks like in the psyche. After the ego dissolves, the system desperately looks for something that doesn't move. And if the deeper self hasn't been embodied yet, awareness itself becomes that platform. Insight becomes ground. Understanding becomes identity. You don't just have awareness anymore. You stand on it. From there, everything feels calmer. You observe instead of risking. You explain instead of descending. You name instead of feeling. And naming feels safe. Jung understood this moment precisely. He saw that when the old center collapses, the psyche will organize itself around something, anything that offers coherence. Awareness, when not integrated, becomes that substitute center. The bridge stops swaying, but the crossing stops too, because the psyche doesn't integrate what it uses as a platform. The emotions that require descent, grief, rage, longing, shame, remain untouched. Not denied, not repressed, just postponed, waiting beneath the structure you're standing on. From the outside, this state looks like maturity. From the inside, it feels like calm without depth. This is why people say they feel fine, but not fulfilled. Clear, but not alive. Stable, but strangely disconnected. Nothing is broken here. Nothing went wrong. The psyche simply chose rest over completion. But the problem with stopping in the middle of the bridge is subtle. The longer you stand there, the more convincing it feels. And the harder it becomes to remember that the movement isn't finished. The crossing is still unfinished. And the other side still exists. The problem with false stability is not that it collapses. It's that it slowly stops nourishing you. At first, standing on that platform feels like relief. The bridge no longer sways. The fog doesn't scare you as much. You've found a place where nothing demands movement. And because nothing feels urgent, you assume this is maturity. But the psyche is not designed to live on a resting point. Over time, something subtle begins to shift. You notice that your insights repeat themselves. The same realizations return, unchanged. You talk about growth, but nothing inside you is actually moving. Your language evolves, but your inner landscape stays the same. This is the first crack. Jung observed that when psychic energy stops flowing forward, it doesn't disappear, it turns inward. It begins to circulate in closed loops. And closed loops feel like clarity, until they start to feel like stagnation. You're not confused anymore, but you're not surprised either. You don't feel lost, but you don't feel drawn forward. The platform holds, but it doesn't expand. And here's where the damage becomes quiet. Because awareness without movement creates a subtle superiority. Not arrogance, distance. You start relating to life from above rather than within it. Emotions become objects of analysis instead of experiences. Relationships feel thinner, not because you care less, but because you're no longer risking yourself inside them. This is when people say things like, "I don't get triggered anymore. I don't get attached anymore. I don't react." But what often vanished wasn't reactivity, it was engagement. The psyche didn't heal the fire. It stepped away from it. And fire, when avoided long enough, doesn't burn, it cools. This is why the platform eventually begins to crack. Not with pain, not with collapse, but with meaning loss. Life feels flat. Purpose feels vague. Joy feels muted. You function, but something essential is missing. And because nothing is wrong, you can stay here for years without realizing what's happening. Jung warned that individuation doesn't tolerate stagnation. If consciousness refuses descent, the unconscious finds other ways to demand attention, through restlessness, subtle depression, or the quiet sense that you've outgrown your own explanations. The psyche doesn't punish you for stopping. It simply waits, and then whispers. Something in you knows the crossing isn't finished. Something in you feels the pull forward again. And the longer you stay on the platform, the clearer that whisper becomes. When the platform starts to crack, most people don't panic. They adjust. And that's where the real mistake deepens. Instead of moving forward, they learn how to live more comfortably in the in-between. They refine the posture. They polish the language. They develop small habits that feel conscious, but quietly keep everything exactly where it is. It shows up in ordinary moments. You wake up and immediately reach for explanation instead of sensation. You analyze the dream instead of feeling the residue it left in your body. You name your emotion. This is attachment. This is projection. This is ego. And the moment you name it, you step away from it. Throughout the day, you correct yourself internally. Don't get too excited. Don't get too attached. Don't react. You turn awareness into a filter that removes intensity before it can touch you. This is why a scene from The Matrix hits so hard when you watch it again as an adult. There's that moment where Neo begins to see the code. The world is still there. People are still talking. Rooms still exist. But something shifts. The realness of it thins out. And the danger isn't that he sees the truth. The danger is what can happen next. He could start living only as an observer, a spectator of reality. Someone who's so busy decoding the system that he forgets to be inside his own life. That's what this phase can become. At work, you stay composed, but you stop feeling invested. You notice dynamics clearly, but nothing moves you enough to act. You understand people, but you no longer feel pulled into genuine exchange. You're watching the code of the office, status games, insecurity, performance. And because you can see it, you assume you're above it. But being above it isn't the same as being alive. In relationships, the shift is even clearer. Someone shares something vulnerable, and instead of responding from your body, you respond from insight. You hold space, but you don't step in. You listen, but you don't reveal. You stay calm, but you don't let yourself be changed by the interaction. It looks mature. It sounds regulated, but it feels distant. You stop saying things that might complicate the connection. You avoid emotional risk in the name of non-attachment. You leave conversations feeling clean and strangely untouched. Even solitude changes. You spend time alone, but it's not restorative. It's observational. You sit with yourself, but you don't let yourself unravel. You meditate, but you stay above the current. You journal, but you explain instead of confess. And slowly, life becomes smooth. Too smooth. There are fewer lows, but also fewer highs. Fewer conflicts, but also fewer moments of genuine aliveness. The days pass efficiently. Meaning becomes conceptual rather than felt. This is how most people fail. not by doing something obviously wrong, but by doing something slightly protective every single day. Each small avoidance feels harmless. Each adjustment feels wise. But together, they form a life where nothing truly penetrates. And then one day, you notice something unsettling. You're not suffering, but you're not touched either. And that realization doesn't arrive as pain. It arrives as a quiet question that has no words yet. There is a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when the false stability stops working. Not because it collapses, but because it no longer satisfies whatever woke up inside you. You may not notice it right away. Life still functions. Your routines hold. Your language remains polished. From the outside, nothing demands attention. But internally, something begins to press against the structure you built. It feels like restlessness without direction, like a hunger without appetite, like standing in a room that suddenly feels too small, even though it hasn't changed. This is usually when people think something went wrong. They assume they are regressing, that the calm they achieved is slipping, that maybe they lost their center. But what's actually happening is more precise than that. The psyche is asking you to come back inside the process. Jung understood that individuation doesn't move in a straight line. It advances through descent and return, insight and embodiment, fire and ash. And every time consciousness expands, there comes a moment when it must descend again, not into chaos, but into contact. This is the part most people misunderstand. They think integration means stabilizing awareness and maintaining control. But real integration asks for something far more unsettling: participation. Not observation, not explanation. Participation. It asks you to let life touch you again. This is where the work changes form. Instead of asking, "What does this mean?" you begin to ask, "What does this move in me?" Instead of naming emotions, you allow them to exist without resolution. You stop correcting yourself in real time. You stop filtering your reactions through the lens of who you think you should be now. And at first, this feels like danger, because re-entering the fire doesn't feel spiritual. It feels messy. It feels human. It feels like losing composure after you worked so hard to gain it. You might notice it in small, almost embarrassing ways. You feel irritation rise, and instead of labeling it and dissolving it, you let yourself feel the heat of it in your chest. You feel attraction, and instead of neutralizing it with insight, you stay present with the pull. You feel sadness, and instead of reframing it, you let it soften you. This is not regression. This is descent. Jung believed that what we refuse to feel consciously, we are forced to live unconsciously. Integration happens when feeling is allowed back into awareness, not to overwhelm it, but to complete it. This is why the return to the fire often comes with fear. Because fire doesn't ask permission. It doesn't negotiate. It transforms what touches it. And part of you knows this. You know that if you step fully back into experience, you might lose the polished identity you've been standing on. You might say something you can't take back. You might feel something that disrupts your balance. You might discover that the person you became during false stability isn't who you're meant to remain. So the psyche hesitates. It circles the edge of participation. This shows up clearly in relationships. You notice moments where you almost reveal something, then pull back. Where you almost speak from the body, then translate it into insight. Where you almost let yourself be changed by the encounter, then retreat into composure. Integration begins the moment you stop retreating. Not dramatically, not recklessly, but honestly. You allow yourself to be affected again. At work, this might mean letting dissatisfaction inform action instead of being neutralized by understanding. You stop explaining why things are the way they are and start responding to how they feel inside you. In relationships, it means risking emotional presence, saying the thing that might complicate the dynamic, staying in the discomfort of closeness instead of floating above it. Letting yourself want without immediately managing the wanting. In solitude, it means letting silence reach deeper than thought. Sitting long enough for sensation to arise. Letting boredom, grief, longing, or tenderness surface without rushing to interpret them. This is where many people realize something unsettling. They weren't stuck because they lacked awareness. They were stuck because they stopped risking contact. Jung called this the return to the living psyche. He believed that consciousness must eventually bow to experience, not as submission, but as partnership. Awareness alone is dry. Experience alone is blind. Wholeness emerges when the two meet. This meeting doesn't feel like enlightenment. It feels like presence. You don't suddenly feel powerful. You feel available. You don't feel above life. You feel inside it again. And that's when something important happens. Meaning returns, not as an idea, but as resonance. Moments begin to matter again. Conversations land. Choices feel weighted. You're no longer managing yourself from a distance. You're responding from within. The fire doesn't consume you. It warms you. This is the moment false stability dissolves on its own. Not because you rejected it, but because you outgrew it. You no longer need the platform. You're walking again. And walking, unlike standing still, requires trust. Trust that you can feel without collapsing. Trust that intensity won't destroy you. Trust that the psyche knows where it's going, even when the path isn't fully visible. This is why most people fail here. Not because the work is too hard, but because it asks for something that insight alone can't give. It asks you to be touched, to let life mark you again, to stop standing above the fire, and step back into it. At some point, you notice a subtle shift. Not a breakthrough, not a revelation, just a change in how you inhabit yourself. You're no longer trying to stay balanced all the time. You're no longer monitoring every reaction, every thought, every emotional fluctuation. Something in you relaxes, not into passivity, but into presence. You stop asking whether you're doing the process right. And that's when the process quietly deepens. Carl Jung believed that individuation reaches maturity not when the ego disappears, but when it stops trying to manage transformation. When consciousness no longer stands above life, interpreting it, but moves alongside it, responding in real time. This is when awakening stops feeling fragile. You no longer feel the need to protect it from emotion. You no longer fear intensity as regression. You no longer confuse composure with growth. You can feel anger without being consumed by it. You can feel longing without immediately transcending it. You can feel grief without turning it into meaning too quickly. And paradoxically, this is when the psyche feels safest. Because safety isn't created by distance. It's created by capacity. You begin to trust that you can be touched by life and remain intact. That emotions can move through you without defining you. That not every inner movement needs to be resolved before it's allowed. This is what integration actually looks like. It's quieter than insight, less impressive than clarity, but far more alive. You notice it in small, ordinary ways. A conversation leaves a mark instead of sliding past you. A choice carries weight instead of being neutralized by understanding. A moment of silence feels inhabited instead of empty. You don't feel above the world anymore. You feel inside it. And that's when the mistake loses its grip. Not because you fought it, but because you no longer need what it offered. The false stability dissolves because real stability has formed underneath it. Not the stability of control, but the stability of contact. Jung would say this is when the psyche finds its true center. Not in insight, not in explanation, but in lived experience that can be reflected upon after it's been lived. You don't lose awareness here. You ground it. You don't abandon consciousness. You embody it. And that embodiment changes everything. Awakening no longer feels like something you might break if you move wrong. It feels like something that can move with you. Bend. Respond. Mature. You stop worrying about whether you'll lose what you've seen. Because what's real doesn't disappear when you enter life. It deepens. If this video resonated with you, consider subscribing to Hidden Mind. Not for answers, but for continuity. Because this work doesn't unfold in isolation, and it rarely completes itself in a single moment of insight. And in the next video, we'll go deeper into spiritual awakening, into the test that appears after this stage, when awareness begins to settle and life quietly asks, how will you live what you've seen? That moment decides whether awakening becomes wholeness, or fades back into something you only remember understanding. So if something in you felt stirred rather than satisfied, that's not unfinished business. That's the process still moving. You're no longer standing on the platform. You're walking again. And this time, you're letting the journey finish what it started.